So for this video, I'm going to be reviewing each of the green spells that are currently in Artifact. I'm going to be talking about which ones see play in Constructed, which ones see play in Draft, and if they don't see play, why is that the case? Why is this card considered bad? And in the future, maybe there are some cards that you want to keep an eye out for that might increase the value of cards that are considered bad now. And as a result of the way I do the reviews, I don't do point systems or star ratings or anything like that. You're not going to hear, 4 out of 5 stars. It's just going to be an assessment of what the card does well and doesn't do well, so that you have a good core knowledge of whatever the card is that I'm reviewing. And if the meta changes, then you can adjust accordingly. So with that explanation out of the way, let's just dive in and start talking about the cards themselves. And we start off with Juke. Juke is a 1-mana spell in green that swaps an ally with one of its allied neighbors. Now, this card can be really beneficial if you're trying to keep a hero alive, or it might be beneficial if you're trying to keep a high value creep alive because you're swapping positions, or sometimes if you're just trying to get more damage in on a tower, it can really help in that regard as well. But the utility that this card provides is just not high enough to see play in Constructed. Constructed, you've got to have a really high power level and or some sort of strong synergy for it to warrant going into the deck, because your deck size is essentially 25 cards. While the deck is 40 cards, 15 of them are always going to be from signature spells, so the cards you include have to be very impactful. And this is just not one of those cases. Juke, okay utility, but not the sort of thing that you're really excited to do most of the time, so it doesn't see play in Constructed. It will occasionally see play in Draft. It's a decent filler card, and it's a decent utility combat trick card, but it's not the sort of thing that you're excited about running. It's not the sort of thing you're picking high in a pack. You don't value this greatly. This thing could rise in value in the future if other cards are printed that benefit whenever you swap positions, right? So you think about your Jukes and your Cunning Plans. If they print future cards in future sets that benefit, maybe increase in attack power if they have swapped positions with something, again, I'm just kind of throwing ideas out. Those would be the kinds of things that might make Juke rise in value, right? Because it creates synergy. But as is right now, not played in Constructed, just too low on the power curve, and occasionally played in Draft, but you're not excited about it. Next up, we have Stars Align. This is another 1-mana spell, and this gives your tower plus 3 mana this round. Unlike Juke, this gives you a lot of value at the 1-mana slot, and this absolutely sees play in both Constructed and in Draft. This is a ramp card. The ramp is a slang term in card games for increasing your resources faster than the game traditionally allows. And Stars Align allows you to potentially play before your opponent is ready for it. Really impactful cards. In Constructed, you're trying to ramp into Spring the Traps, Time of Triumph, Incarnation of Salamene. There's a number of different combo-oriented decks that abuse this card. This card works even better when you combine it with tower mana reset effects like Aghanim Sanctum. It's just really good. And it's still good in Draft, because a lot of times in Draft, you do get a couple of late game bombs. It might not be like an Emissary of the Quorum, but you'll draft a couple of Thunderhide packs or something in that regard, and being able to play those sooner rather than later is really beneficial. So Stars Align, aka Dark Ritual, if you're an old Magic veteran, is very, very good in Constructed and in Draft. And as long as mana is used to balance things, meaning more expensive cards are more powerful, cards like this will remain powerful because they let you play them faster. So this will be around for quite some time. Next up, we have Bellow. This is 2 mana, and you move a creep to a random other lane. This is not played much in Constructed, but it is played very frequently in Draft as typically a 1 or a 2 of. And the reason that it's played is because it is versatile. So you can take a creep that is in front of one of your high value targets and send it packing so that you can push damage to the tower. You can take a creep that might kill one of your heroes and send it somewhere else so that you save your hero. but it's just to move a creep, not an enemy creep. So if you win a lane and you then want to send a creep to another lane that you're trying to pressure, Bellow might get that job done. For example, if you play a Thunderhide pack and then you take down a tower and you don't think, hey, I have any capability of racing the Ancient here, you can use Bellow on your Thunderhide pack and hope that it lands in the other lane that you want to pressure. So Bellow has a decent amount of versatility and utility in draft, where the general power level of decks is much lower than constructed, so you're okay if you run this as a 1 of, maybe a 2 of. I typically don't value picking this high in draft. I value first, like what I call the bombs. Those are the cards that do incredible things that can swing a game in your favor. These are the Annihilations, the Time of Triumphs, etc. You also pick very highly the incredibly powerful heroes, you know, your Phantom Assassins, your axes, things like that. And then I tend to value creeps just because I like bodies. So if you get a good valuable creep, I would pick that over a Bellow, but overall I'm still not unhappy if I have to run it. Next up we have Defend the Weak. This is a 2 mana spell. You modify a unit with this unit's allied neighbors get +2 armor. In other words, you turn a unit into a treant, and this card is surprisingly good. It did not see a lot of play in the closed beta when I first started playing, but I saw it start to creep up in the closed beta as people were experimenting. I've seen it a few times in constructed as a 1 or a 2 of since then, and it's pretty decent for like a combat trick that is cheap, specifically in green. You know, in green you're not likely to get many cycle effects, but something like this where it's a modify effect, so you can use it as a one-time combat trick, but if you play it on a hero, then you're getting recurring value, likely for the rest of the game. That is really impactful and annoying to deal with. So I'm not going to say this is like an auto-include in green decks, because it's not, but it has been slowly creeping up a little bit more frequently as like a tech choice in some green decks that I've seen. It is very, very good in draft because it's modify, and because, you know, basics and fundamentals tend to matter a lot more in draft. I do like this card a lot. Again, I'm not picking this high. I would pick this before a Bellow, but I would still prefer things that directly impact the board in a more tangible way, something that like a creep. Again, the reason I value creeps highly in draft is that they are both proactive and reactive. They can use themselves as meat shields, or you can use them as damage against a tower. Cards like this is, you know, one-dimensional. This is a reactive card to try to protect your stuff. So I would still value high-quality creeps over this, but as those things get removed from packs, yeah, Defend the Weak is pretty solid. And then next up we have Iron Branch Protection. This is a 2-mana spell. You give a unit in any lane +3 armor until the end of its next combat phase. So what you essentially trade off from Defend the Weak here is that you don't get the permanent modification, and you gain 1 extra armor and cross lane playability. It's okay. I'm not really a huge fan of this card. The cross lane playability makes it nice, but if you're playing it cross lane, then you're also telegraphing, like, I'm going to protect this, and your opponent can play around it. It's really beneficial, or more beneficial, played in lane where they do something and then you respond with this. So it's like pseudo healing, and if you're doing this cross lane, you're not responding to something that they have played yet. So the cross lane thing is okay, but not really like the real value here. It's not like it's like some of the black spells are cross lane damage, and that's proactive. So like when you use those, you're likely killing a hero, and then your opponent has no chance to respond. With something like this, you're trying to like preempt something you're expecting, and then you've tipped your hand, right? Like you've given away the information. So I'm not as big a fan of this. I also just, if I was given a choice, I would prefer Defend the Weak because of the permanent modification. And yeah, if this cycled, I might like it more, but it doesn't, so it's only okay. Speaking of okay, Avernus' Blessing is not even okay. You modify a unit with +2 attack. There is not a lot to write home about here. This is really low on the power curve. Does not see play in Constructed. I barely see it in Draft. If it is in Draft, it's because somebody was using it as a filler card because they wanted to do like a 2-color draft, and instead of splashing, they're playing some pretty mediocre cards of one of the colors they're running. This is just not good. It doesn't cycle. Yeah, it's a modify, but it's only +2 attack, and a lot of times if you're playing this on like a creep or something to secure a kill against an opposing hero, then the modify doesn't matter. It's just, you're paying 3 for +2 attack. It's just not great. The red version of this doesn't really see play either, so. Next up we have Rumesk, however you pronounce it. I always slaughter this one too, but you get Blessing. Unlike Iron Branch Protection, this is a cross-lane card that I very much like in green. For 3 mana, you choose a lane and you modify allies' health in that lane with +3 health. It's all allies, so it's your creeps, it's your heroes, and it's modify. So you can typically use this to sometimes save your entire board for an extra combat round, because 3 health is meaningful, specifically when you're having creeps that are lined up against opposing melee creeps. Then the +3 health is greater than the 2 damage that they're going to be doing. But also because it's modify, if you play this on a lane where you have 2 or 3 heroes, then those heroes have their health modified, and if they ever receive healing or they die and they come back, then their base health is going to be that much higher. So it's just a great card. In Draft, if I can snag these, I try to. I like to run about 2 of them as a good target when I'm running green, but it's a quality card. Does not see a ton of play in Constructed just because the health matters a little bit less there. +3 health on a melee creep gets it to 7 health, and theoretically that means it survives at any cost, but that's assuming that they've taken 0 damage prior, which is really unlikely. So using this to counter at any cost is just not likely, and the health doesn't matter against Annihilation, so not quite Constructed playable yet, but definitely playable in Draft. And then next up we have Arm the Rebellion. This is a 4 mana spell, and you modify allied creeps with +2 attack and +1 armor. This again, not really good enough to see play in Constructed for the same reason that Blessing doesn't. It doesn't do enough to counter the AoE removal spells that are played against wide boards, right? At any cost, basically still wrecks this. Annihilation definitely still wrecks this. But in Draft, where those cards are far less prevalent, this card is really, really good. In fact, this is like green's version of Disciple. You can sometimes surprise push a tower for 80 with this card, and because it's modifying the creeps with not only +2 attack but +1 armor, you know, even if you only hit like 3 melee creeps with this, or like 2 melee creeps and some creep you've played from hand, you can still get an awful lot of value out of this in Draft. So I am a fan of this. Much like the Blessing, if I can snag 1 or 2 of these, I'm usually pretty happy. My standard rule still applies though. I prefer just playing bodies over something like this, but this is a pretty solid card in Draft. Next up we have Caught Unprepared. 4 mana, stun a hero until they equip an item. This is one of those cards that I tried to make work in the closed beta. In theory, it seems like it should be beneficial, right? Because you're stunning an enemy hero, which means they're locked out of playing stuff until the stun is removed. And if you're stunning them until they equip an item and they don't have items in their hand, you can maybe catch them off guard for multiple rounds. But in Constructed, most decks have pretty consistent ways to generate gold, and even in Draft, while you don't have a lot of consistent ways to generate gold, you're usually running a lot of the basic items. Almost everybody's running at least like 3 Traveler's Cloaks, for example. So it's not that hard to pick up an item. So at most, this will, you know, make a hero be stunned for a round, you know, start to finish. And sometimes less. Sometimes you'll play this and they will just have the item in their hand, and they immediately remove the stun, and then they go back to playing cards for their turn. So it's one of those cards I kind of keep an eye on, because if the meta ever changes to where people's item decks are a lot of expensive items, or maybe there's this weird scenario where people are burning through their items quickly, and then they're less likely to have them on hand because they are spending them recklessly. Then maybe this rises in value, but for the most part, the stun seems like it should be really strong, but it's pretty easily countered and played around. So it does not see a lot of play in Constructed or Draft at the moment because of the availability of items. Next up we have Cleansing Rite. This is 4 mana to purge your opponent's effects from a hero. This is a pretty neat effect to have in the game, and I understand why it's here, but paying 4 mana for something so situational is just not good enough, because many times, even if you do actually have a target, and there's no guarantee that you will have a target for this, they might not debuff your heroes at all, but even if you do have a target, a lot of times it's just a single effect. It might be Viscous Nasal Goo, it might be Track, or things along those lines, and if they spend 3 mana to track your hero and you spend 4 mana to remove it, then they've kind of gained mana tempo on you. If they spend 4 mana on a Nasal Goo and then you spend 4 mana on the Cleansing Rite, then you kind of stared at each other. But the difference is that Nasal Goo is a signature card, and this is something you willingly chose to put in your deck. It would have to take up one of those precious 25 card slots, and as such, it's just too low on the power curve. Does not see play in Constructed, does not see play in Draft. It could rise in value if we start seeing really strong debuff effects show up in the future, or things that apply multiple debuffs, but at the moment, just not good enough to include. Next up we have Defensive Bloom. 4 mana, summon 2 Roseleaf Walls. What are those, you ask? They are 0/8 creeps. Pretty straightforward. This card, not strong enough, not powerful enough to see play in Constructed, but does see some play in Draft, because those 0/8 walls will soak a lot of damage. This is a great stall card if you're just trying to survive, and in Draft it's even better if you can play this in a lane where you have an Enchantress, or you have like a Treant, because they will keep the Roseleaf Walls alive even longer. If you have a Mist of Avernus there, then the Roseleaf Walls can actually start attacking, which is pretty fun and cheeky. And even something like Arm the Rebellion can arm your walls. So in Draft, does see some play. Typically, as a filler card, it's not the sort of thing that a lot of people prioritize. If you're running a deck that, like I said, has Enchantress and Treant in it, you might consider picking one of these up as well, just because of the synergy there. But it is just a stall card. This is a I don't want to die. In many ways, you could treat this as like healing for your tower. That's what happens. You play it and you just soak damage for a bit. So not good enough to see play in Constructed. Situational in Draft, doesn't come up a lot. Speaking of healing, Restoration Effort, 4 mana, heal your tower, 8. Not very good. I mean, listen, it could be good in the right situation, but it's not good enough to see play in Constructed, and it really doesn't see play in Draft, because it does nothing to your board. It's a one-time effect, and you would rather be playing something like Defensive Bloom in most cases over a card like this, because this is just a one-time heal. It does not increase your board presence at all. And if Defensive Bloom is situational, and this card is, kind of objectively worse than that, it's just not going to see play. So next up we have Soul of Spring. Modify a hero with, after you play a green card, give this hero and its allied neighbors +4 regeneration this round. This card actually sees play. It's typically included in Constructed as like a one-of tech choice. In fact, I believe Life Coach and his crew brought a copy of it to the We Play tournament. I've seen it a few other times as well, because +4 regeneration is pretty significant, and the fact that this is modify any hero, a lot of times cards like this are like modify a black hero, modify a red hero. This one is modify any hero and then you can still play green cards and get benefits. So it's great in that regard. Like I said, +4 regeneration is pretty significant, and then if you can get multiple triggers, this can really stall out a lane. This is a great card in draft for the same reasons. You can really keep your heroes and some surrounding neighbors, whether those are heroes or creeps, alive. Quality protection card. Next up we have Steel Strength. 4 mana, give a unit -4 attack this round, and give another unit +4 attack this round. This card is pretty good. I tried to make it work a couple of times in Constructed, and it's on the cusp of being strong enough, but ultimately, if it is ran in Constructed, it's usually as like a one-of, kind of like gotcha surprise, or in tournament play where you have open deck lists, it's the sort of thing you might include as a one-of just to make your opponent play around it, but it's not quite good enough where you're jamming 3 of these into each of your green decks by any means. It's very good in draft though. If I can pick these up in draft, I'm typically happy. This is a high quality combat trick. Most of the combat tricks in this game, you may have noticed, are like swap positions or, you know, attack a different target. This has the potential to shut down one enemy, right? Whether it's making a hero do far less damage, making a creep do no damage. I mean, you can really get a lot of value out of the -4 attack. And then the +4 attack can oftentimes swing things in your favor to kill an opposing hero or get 4 extra damage in on a tower. It's a very versatile card with pretty big swings in power on both ends, and as such, it definitely sees play in draft. It's very swingy in that regard. Next up we have Corrosive Mist. 5 mana, condemn all equipped items. So this only affects the lane that you play it in, and it does condemn all equipped items, so it will remove your own items as well. So one thing to note is that if you remove health items from a hero and the losing of that health item would result in them dying, this will remove the item and kill them. Like the way health addition and subtraction works in Artifact does result in hero death from that. So this can be cheeky fun. I tried really hard to make this work in the closed beta, specifically because there was a time when there was an awful lot of like gold generation and like payday decks floating around. So I tried a mid-rangey red-green variant where I was trying to run Revtel Convoys and Mercenary Exiles to have those be the source of like using my gold, and then instead of buying items, I was running 3 copies of Corrosive Mist to eat the expensive items my opponents were playing, right? So if they played a Horn of the Alpha, the idea was then I Corrosive Mist before they get to activate Horn. I feel no ill effects because I'm not buying items on purpose. It just wasn't quite good enough. It felt clunky. You never have the Mist when you need it, and the problem with not buying items on purpose is if you don't get a card like Mist, then you gave yourself a pretty big disadvantage for the rest of the game. And then even when you get Mist, sometimes they don't get their big items, so you don't get the benefit of having drawn your Mist anyway. So it looked really good on paper, fell really flat in execution. You don't see a lot of it in Constructed, but it is one of those ones that you'll want to keep your eye on, again, as a potential tech choice. If the meta does shift to be very item heavy, I could see something like this start showing up again. It's a fine tech choice in draft as well. If you are running it there, it's probably as a one-of-one because it's a rare, so you're not likely drafting more than one, but also because it is going to be very situational with how you use or apply it, but you could get some value out of it and some decent surprise factor. So it's one of those like borderline playable cards that just needs something more to go its way before it becomes more popular. But right now, still a bit too clunky. Next up we have Divine Intervention. 5 mana, give allies damage immunity this round. Now, a couple of things to note. This is all your allies, so this is your creeps and your heroes, but it is also damage immunity, so this does not protect your stuff from condemn effects. They can still get hit with coup de grace, your board can still die to annihilation, and it's that second one that really drives the value of this card down in Constructed play. This card, one, it's more expensive than an At Any Cost. As I stutter through that, I apologize. But the point is that this is likely coming online a turn or two too late in that regard, and while it does technically come online before Annihilation, it does nothing to stop Annihilation. So there's just not enough benefit for you to consider including something like this in Constructed right now. The decks that don't run Annihilation and don't run At Any Cost are ones that are probably trying to outrace you, and a card like this doesn't help you a ton in that regard. And if this doesn't also help you against the control decks that are trying to purposefully kill your board, then it's hard for this to find a spot. In Draft, this is entirely playable as like a 1 or a 2 of, typically a 1 of. It's a very nice combat trick. You're less worried about Annihilation in Draft for obvious reasons, and as such, this can swing a very contested board heavily in your favor, and it works out beautifully there because you're not worried about mass condemn effects, and then it can really shine. So good in Draft, not really good enough in Constructed. Next up we have Intimidation. 5 mana, move a unit to a random other lane. So this is Bellow's big brother, and much like Bellow, this is not quite good enough to see play in Constructed. I have seen it a couple of times. People included it as a 1 of tech choice, but mostly I see it in Draft, and in Draft it really shines for a lot of the same reasons that Bellow does, except for now you can apply that same logic to heroes. So if you have initiative, you can send your enemy's hero packing, and then they might not be able to play cards at all, or at least cards of a certain color. You can use it to get rid of heroes and creeps in front of your stuff if you want to hit a tower. If you want to save your own hero, again, same concept. And then much like Bellow, if you have won a lane, you've knocked down a tower, and you don't think you can kill the Ancient, you can use Intimidation on your own heroes and hope that they land someplace more beneficial. So just good utility for the card, and great in Draft. Not quite good enough for Constructed, and if it is your preferred tech choice, you're probably doing it as a 1 of. Next up we have Curse of Atrophy. 6 mana, modify enemy heroes with -2 attack. So it is every enemy hero, and if you can play this in a lane where there's like 3 enemy heroes, you can actually get a lot of long-term value out of it. But in Constructed, the impact of this is just too low for it to typically matter. When you compare this at 6 versus something like Time of Triumph at 8, this feels really lackluster, and rightfully so. You're not really feeling great about playing this. Even comparing this to something like Routed, right? If you have the choice between Curse of Atrophy hitting 3 heroes or Routed hitting 3 heroes, you'd pick Routed every time. So not quite good enough to see playing Constructed. I've played it a couple of times in Draft. It's very situational there as well. I got it to work maybe once, but overall, paying 6 for something that is oftentimes pretty low impact, because it's usually like 2 heroes or less, just doesn't feel great. So it's okay in Draft, not the sort of thing that I would pick high, not the sort of thing I would prioritize. I'd much rather have bodies, and honestly I would even still rather have cards like Intimidation that we just looked at. So yeah, you know, it's not the worst card, but not really great in the current meta. And then the last card we have, the last green spell, is Divine Purpose. 7 mana, modify a unit with damage immunity. So Divine Intervention gave your board damage immunity this round. This gives 1 unit damage immunity forever. And in Constructed, it faces the same problems, the same hiccups that Divine Intervention does, which is there are plenty of condemn effects around, so Divine Purpose just doesn't feel great, especially at 7 mana. You know, you're making probably one of your heroes immune to damage, and your opponent's probably playing Spring the Trap on you and generating a lot of board presence. It's just too slow. In Draft, however, it can be really annoying in Draft, because the game is typically slower in Draft, and the fundamentals matter a little bit more. And so if you can modify a hero specifically annoying heroes that provide benefit to those around them, like enchantresses and things like that. If you can provide one of those with damage immunity, you can create like an undying wall in certain lanes. So it's playable in draft. I've played it in draft and actually used it on a creep before. I played a Thunderhide pack, slapped this on it the next round because I knew my opponent was not running Slay at the time, and it ended up winning me the game because it took down that tower, and then I used a Bellow to ship it to another lane, and then it took down that tower. So definitely good enough to see play in draft. It's a rare, so it's usually going to be as a one of anyway, but I would only ever recommend it as a one of. It does not impact the board on its own, but it is a long-term value card that shines a lot more in draft. So that's it for the green spells. Hopefully this helped you in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, I apologize for sitting through all of my rambling, but if you made it this far, you did it, and I appreciate you. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.